beginning on page 369. This diagram shows us a causal association. We observe an association between a certain characteristic or an exposure and a disease, and the characteristic or the exposure causes that disease. This is a causal relationship, and causation here is indicated by the arrow connecting the two boxes. It is also possible, however, that we can observe an association, as shown here, not because the characteristic or exposure causes the disease, but because both of them are linked to a third factor. Both are linked to a third factor, and that results in an observed association that is not causal. For example, this slide shows two possible interpretations of the well-known association of increased cholesterol and increased risk of coronary heart disease. On the left is a causal relationship, on the right is a confounded relationship. Here we see that increased cholesterol causes an increased risk of coronary heart disease. Here we see that increased cholesterol is observed to be associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, not because they're causally related, but because a third factor, called factor X, is linked to increased cholesterol and is a cause of coronary heart disease. What could that be? It could, for example, be the genetic profile of the individual. There could be a group of individuals who have a genetic profile that puts them at increased risk of coronary heart disease, and that same genetic profile is associated with an increased cholesterol. Well, you might ask, why do I care? What's the importance of this? The importance is that if the true model is what we see on the left, then if I can intervene and get people to lower their cholesterol, I can anticipate that I'm going to be able to lower their risk of coronary heart disease. But if the model is a confounded one that we see on the right, no matter what I do to reduce the cholesterol, I'm unlikely to have any impact on the risk of coronary heart disease, which is being caused by that genetic profile. So understanding whether a relationship is causal or confounded is extremely important. Here is another example. Many years ago, Dr. Brian McMahon, professor and chairman of the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard, reported an association between increased coffee consumption and cancer of the pancreas. The question arose, was the association that he reported a causal one, or was it the result of confounding? On the left again, a causal relationship. Increased coffee consumption causes an increased risk of cancer of the pancreas, and therefore we have an observed association of the two. On the right, we have the same observed association because both are associated with factor X. What could factor X be? One suggestion was that factor X could be cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is known to be a cause of increased risk of cancer of the pancreas. It is also known that you almost never find a cigarette smoker who doesn't drink coffee. There's a close link between cigarette smoking and coffee consumption. So that if we observe an increased risk of cancer of the pancreas in people who drink more coffee, it could be not because there's a causal relationship, but because both of them are associated with cigarette smoking. Clearly, the interpretation has major clinical and public health implications, depending which one appears to be correct. Finally, I want to show you a more recent example of a study that appeared within the past few months that raised the question of whether high blood levels of Agent Orange are associated with a high prevalence of diabetes in adults. The authors reported an observed association of increased blood levels of Agent Orange and prevalence of diabetes. Well, what does that association mean? It is possible, if the association is true, that we are really seeing the result of a causal relationship, that high blood levels of Agent Orange cause a high prevalence of diabetes. That is certainly one explanation. But the possibility was raised that this association that we observe might be due to confounding. How could that happen? We know that obesity is a risk factor for diabetes. We also know that the dioxins, which Agent Orange is a mixture, dioxins are stored in the fat tissue, in the adipose tissue. And therefore, we would expect higher blood levels of dioxin in people who have more cells storing the dioxins. Therefore, it is possible that we observe the association between high blood levels of Agent Orange and high prevalence of diabetes because both are associated with obesity. Obesity we know is a risk factor for diabetes, and obesity is linked to high levels of Agent Orange in the blood. This has not yet been clarified what the nature of this relationship is, but it is evidence that the problem of confounding is a terribly important one that we have to take into account. And it is a problem that you're going to hear about in the courts as you hear expert witnesses testify about whether confounding has been taken into account in a given case. We will come back to that in a few moments. What is the problem in the courts? We can have a recognized confounder, such as cigarette smoking in the example I just gave you, or we can have unrecognized confounders. We can have it as a legitimate problem. That is, there can be a potential confounder, a factor that we know may be a confounder, but it was not studied in the research that's being reported and presented as evidence. And that would be a deficiency in the study. But we often hear the statement made in trying to dispute a study, quote, all confounders have not been taken into account, but no specific confounders that have been omitted are listed by the person who is trying to disparage the study. The world is full of potential confounders. All we can expect is that confounders will be taken into account if they appear to be likely to be relevant in the given situation. And so the second statement is much too general to be worth very much. The person who wants to make that criticism has to say what are the specific confounders that could have affected the relationship that were not taken into consideration by the investigator. At this point, then, let's just summarize. If we observe an association, it can be non-causal or causal. If it's non-causal, it can be due to chance, to bias, or to confounding. Or it may indeed be causal. I'd like to turn now to some questions regarding science and scientific evidence. These are questions that have been raised with me over the years by judges who are dealing with epidemiologic evidence in their courtrooms. First, why don't human and animal studies always agree? This can be very disturbing. One scientist gets up and testifies about findings from animal studies. An epidemiologist may get up and testify about findings from human studies, and the findings don't agree. We're obviously dealing with different types of subjects. You cannot automatically extrapolate in dose or in effect from animals to human beings. And so there are very legitimate reasons why the studies may disagree. Secondly, we are asked, why do epidemiologic studies or epidemiologists often disagree? And that's a more difficult problem, and the reason we often disagree, maybe not that often, but the reason we may disagree is because there may be questions about certain methodologic issues in the study. There may be questions about differences in how we interpret the data, and this can be extremely complex. Judges will ask, why do many scientists often refuse to commit themselves and seem to hedge in their opinions? The reason that scientists will often refuse to commit themselves and seem to hedge in their opinions is because there is not an endpoint in science. The scientist is seeking the truth. Today's truth may be modified tomorrow by further studies, where the dilemma arises that in a trial, a judgment has to be made yes or no. But science doesn't work in that way. It works in small increments of knowledge, and we are always subject to having our opinions refuted tomorrow. And finally, how can I tell who is an expert whom I can reasonably